Welcome, I'm Eric Ekman, and I'm here with my friend and colleague Kayla Konakis. She's a PhD student with the University College Cork and an Islam specialist. Today, we are talking about the 2007 film Persepolis and its key points, along with some of the history of Iran as it pertains to the movie. Kayla, can you provide some context of Persepolis for us? As an Islamicist, discuss some of the history and context of Iran for me.
The 2007 film is based off of the graphic novel from 2000. After becoming familiar with these materials, I read the script along with academic journals related to the film. My main question was, what does this film reveal of the time and place it was set and also created, specifically having to do with class and revolution? I feel the ideas of amplification through simplification of visuals are important, which allows the viewer to put themselves in the place of the protagonist. Although I'm not a specialist in visual theory, we can delve into a direct analysis of shots and art style together in a later video. I do believe this is important, however, as otherwise the visual elements of Persepolis may not have been so relatable.
The movie reveals Martine's life story in a collection of flashbacks to her adolescence, as she waits in an airport attempting to return to Iran as an adult. What events are happening in the film, and how do they reveal something about Iran to us?
There are two separate groups of events which are important to distinguish: historical events and events in Marjane's life. Marjane's father recounts to her the history of Iran. The Shah's father overthrew the Qajar dynasty in 1925 with help from the British in exchange for extravagant oil concessions, which later financially crippled the economy and added to the dissatisfaction of the Shah and his son. For a brief period of time, Mohammad Mossadegh was prime minister, and he launched a plan to nationalize Iran's oil industry. However, in 1953, an American-led coup removed him from power in order to protect Anglo-American oil interests, and Mohammad Reza Shah was reinstated. In February of 1979, the monarchy was overthrown and replaced with an Islamic republic. In 1982, Marjane was sent to Vienna, as her parents feared her rebelliousness would get her in trouble or even executed. This started a new period of her life. She found that even though she didn't really fit in Iran, she didn't really fit in Vienna either. She falls in love with Marcus, and when a year later she discovers him cheating on her, she starts living on the street, eventually returning to Iran, only on the promise that her family won't ask her about her stay in Vienna.
How did the American support impact Iran during all of these types of conflicts?
The American backed White Revolution, or Constitutional Revolution, had modernizing and nationalistic goals of emancipating Iran from Russian and British control. During the second Shah's reign, America was a close ally of Iran, providing a large amount of economic and military support. Many Iranians saw this as trading Russian and British control for American control and not Iranian independence. We can see this distrust of the West, and America specifically, several times in Persepolis. One thing that is remarkable of the Shah's reforms was the land reform program of 1962, which transferred land from the upper class elite to the poor peasants. However, the peasants did not have enough land or labor to support themselves off of this land, instead choosing to sell the land and move into cities where there was work and education. This urban shift of the population, as well as new access to education, led to an intelligentsia class of Iranians who later used their education to mobilize against the Shah, what the scholar Ramazani calls the army of knowledge.
Okay, Kayla, you're a specialist in Islam. How can we understand Islam in Persepolis?
One of the most interesting things to me is that Islam is only directly identified once in the entire movie. However, as viewers, we don't need it overtly stated to understand that notions of Iranian Islam, specifically Shia Islam, permeates every aspect of the characters' lives, from what they wear, how they act, and what jobs they perform. Although young Margie describes herself as being very religious, as the revolution continues, she begins to question why God hasn't intervened. This seeming ambivalence about God's intervention is mirrored several times throughout the film. When her uncle Tahir needs a visa to get surgery in Europe, a regime-appointed medical officer echoes this ambivalence, saying, "If God wills it, he will get better. It all depends on God." Her faith continues to deteriorate until her uncle Anush is executed by the Islamic regime, and God's presence is lost from the movie, although he does appear once more in the film to save Marjane from suicide. Added to her struggle with identity, Marjane also struggles with belief and her self-proclaimed prophethood. Marjane feels that she was born with religion in her body. She recounts her desire to become the last prophet in the galaxy to her grandmother with 5 rules. 1. Everyone shall be well behaved. 2. Everyone shall do one good deed. 3. Everyone shall always keep their word. 4. 1 roast chicken per person every day. And 5. Grandmothers will never suffer again. Now, Marjane doesn't know how she will teach or enforce these rules, instead saying, with childhood innocence, that it simply won't be allowed. Her grandmother becomes her first and only disciple. However, this is something we see Marjane struggling with throughout the movie. Throughout the movie, we see Marjane break all of these proclamations at least once. The last one, though she was always unable to solve it, I believe this is the one that weighed on Marjane the most heavily. Unlike in many Western societies where the base building block is the individual, in Iran, the base building block of society is the family. Nowhere is this more present than in Persepolis. To Marjane, not only is her family enough reason to brave returning to a country where she knows she and others can be executed for seemingly innocuous actions, like listening to certain music, but without them, she doesn't feel like she has direction or identity. Various members of her family also play different roles in her life. Her father encourages her inquisitive nature, whereas her mother is more realistic and cautious. After her rebellion at school, her father proudly compares her to Uncle Anoush, and her mother reminds them of his fate. Uncle Anoush played a short but exciting role in Marjane's childhood, inspiring her to open her mind to different ideas and ideologies. Her grandmother is arguably the most important role in her life, being both a symbol of unwavering justice and morality, and also the ultimate martyr for Marjane's freedom. More than anything else in the movie, the scene where her grandmother spends the night seems like the most religious experience to Marjane, describing the jasmine flowers which fell from her bosom as she readied herself for sleep as an almost redeeming event for Marjane.
So, the ideas of family, freedom, and identity are important throughout the entire film. But I'm not familiar with Islam. How can a person like me understand Marjane and, by extension, Persepolis?
The film in Marjane can be divided into 2 parts, her time in Iran and her time in Europe. The juxtaposition of Eastern Marji with Western Marji creates a relationship of East and West, which contrasts the stereotypes of the Islamic regime as oppressive and backward against the Western conviction of its own progressive liberalism. The film shows many unfamiliar images of both the East and the West, as Marjane struggles with belonging. This in-betweenness that Marjane experiences in the film serves as a point of resistance against power, both on the Islamic regime and also the Western stereotypes and assumptions about the otherness of Iran. The image of the West, portrayed in Iran, is not a cultural import from the West itself, but instead a form of idealized version of the West, created by Iranians themselves. We see this in the music Marji listens to, the clothing she wears, some of the conversations she has with friends and family. Marjane and other young Iranians before the revolution did not passively accept Western culture, but instead actively interacted with the West through a multitude of mediums like art, music, philosophy, and social theories like Marxism. However, later, after the revolution, many anti-regime Iranians seemed to become less accepting of Western media and practices, and all of these became cliched tools of resistance against the regime. Overall, the more pressure the upper and middle classes felt from the Iranian government to comply with the new Islamic rules, the more they consumed anything Western just to get some sense of relief. Despite her aspirations as a modern woman, Marjane is still influenced by her upbringing and experiences in Iran. While staying at a nunnery in Vienna, she yells at some of the nuns, calling them prostitutes, a similar insult that was used against women in Iran.
Can you tell us more about women in Iran?
Before the revolution under Reza Shah, women were forced to unveil. Under the new Islamic regime, women were once again not given a choice and were forced to veil themselves. The new Islamic regime enforced strict Islamic dress for women, and morality police, both male and female, paroled the streets, searching for infractions or anything Western and therefore un-Islamic. Showing wrists or ankles, laughing loudly, or even wearing makeup are not particularly Western, but they become so in a context in which the slightest departure from the Islamic code of dress and behavior is labeled as politically rebellious. Men were, of course, not held to the same standards of modesty as women, although they were affected. When Marjane confronts an all-male morality council at her college, she is met with a mixture of admiration and condemnation for both her male and female pupils. Women in Iran face many different challenges, including the threat of sexual violence or unfair treatment in courts, especially over family disputes. In the criminal justice system, the testimony of female victims is regarded as half the weight of a man's, and victims of sexual crimes are often prosecuted and punished for adultery. When Marjane is arrested for holding hands with her boyfriend, her father recalls holding hands in public with her mother. He sighs, resigned that the Iran he knew no longer exists.
In the final scene, a taxi driver in France asks her where she's from. With a sigh, she answers with only one word: Iran. What are your thoughts on this scene?
Well, Marjane is still at war with her place in the world. Although now she struggles less with her identity as Iranian, she still faces the fact that she can never return to her home, forced to live in the in-between that she has felt throughout her entire life. As Marjane says, freedom always has a price. And for many Iranians in diaspora, this price has been their families, their careers, and their homes. In 2009, over 3 million demonstrators filled the streets of Tehran to peacefully protest Russian-backed Ahmadinejad's win in the presidential election. Deemed the Green Movement, these protests were simply a spilling over point of decades of frustration. The Green Movement was diverse, but led by the intelligentsia, professors and students. In response, the regime closed all pro-green newspapers, magazines, and websites, and imprisoned waves of journalists. Neda Agha Sultan was the first death of these protests, shot by the military. Her death was internationally publicized and became a new symbol of ongoing Iranian struggle. As Tifin Lezervo said, just as the regime forced the Iranian poor into acting as fundamentalists, promising them paradise for demining more fields, it also indirectly fostered a particular westernization of the elite and middle class.